Oh, somewhere in our family albums, and I don't know where because we just moved, but somewhere in our family albums, there's a picture of our daughter about age 4, little curly blonde ringlets, and the rest of her preschool class, and they're all lined up, and they're all dressed up to resemble pilgrims for Thanksgiving. And my daughter really stands out because she's the one scowling. She's just got pure resentment on her face, and she does not look thankful for anything. It's because she didn't like being dressed up for other people's entertainment. She didn't give a flying fig about pilgrims or Native Americans or any of that old narrative. She just knew that they stuffed her into this outfit, and all the adults were like, ah! And she I treasure that photo because I get kind of snarly when people, project their narratives on me. I don't like that either. And when it comes to Thanksgiving, what we're wrestling with now is narrative. Because at this point, we're all adults. We've all started doing that critical examination of colonialism that interrupted and stopped that grade school story. Because now we know that no amount of gravy can make genocide palatable. But there's something about that story that's still powerful. We know that it's woven out of myths and lies, but there's still something there. So let's go back. Let's take a look at that old narrative. Let's see how we might reweave it for our future. Okay, the old story. The characters are the pilgrims who sought religious freedom in the New World, the kindness of Squanto, there was corn and pumpkins, there were the grateful new settlers who were welcomed into their new land by natives that they called Indians, who taught them how to plant corn and beans and squash, and to celebrate the harvest in 1621, they had a big party that is now called the first Thanksgiving, and they ate for 3 days, and they even played ball games. It was so cool. Oh, the pious people and the savages alike. Oh, giving thanks for God's bounty. Okay, you know that story, right? You've heard that one. But there are several versions of the story. Some of them are more grievous. Truthfully, the year leading up to that first Thanksgiving was horrible for the settlers. Of the group that had left from England to settle, half of them died in that first year. So by the time that the survivors sat down and ate with the native peoples for 3 days, half of their families were in nearby graves. In some more tender versions of that narrative, the native people are depicted as having pity on these woefully underprepared settlers, invaders. And part of the story, though, that's coming out now is that the native people themselves were still reeling from the ravages of illnesses that had been brought by previous explorers. The New England that the Pilgrims came to included the graves of well over half of the earlier population of indigenous people. Those deep losses are never quite reconciled in most versions of the story. Sitting down to share, knowing that half of your people are gone. And what was this day of Thanksgiving in 1621? Well, for the Puritan settlers, it wasn't. You see, it wasn't a day of Thanksgiving. Their religious leaders would proclaim days of Thanksgiving to acknowledge important events for which you should be thankful, like a really good rain when you needed it for the crops. And these days were proclaimed by the church leaders, and they were spent in church, in prayer, as a religious observation. So that 3 days of feasting and kicking balls around with Indians, that was actually an event to seal a treaty. It wasn't a day of Thanksgiving. This was a civic sort of thing. And those of us who've read deeper history remember how treaties always turned out. Now, as the Puritans became Congregationalists, and some of the Congregationalists even became Unitarians, local governments in the colonies adapted and adopted the habit of declaring a day of Thanksgiving, usually in the fall to coincide with the harvest. But when the government did it, notice it was a civic holiday more than a church holiday. And they made it up to local municipalities and governments to decide when you would do that. Each state decided on their own. And our current narrative went and morphed that 1621 event into the first Thanksgiving, thanks to a Unitarian minister. The Reverend Alexander Young discovered a written account of that 1621 event, and he included it in a book that he published in 1841. Okay, we're already 200 years after the fact. And in that book, he just added a footnote identifying that the event, quote, was to the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England. It wasn't. But he was familiar with Thanksgiving, and this looked sort of like a Thanksgiving to him, and so he decided it was. And, you can do that when you're writing history. Meanwhile, one Mrs. Sarah Josepha Hale, a widow, raising a family of 5 as an editor for a popular women's magazine, in 1846, as the country was being ripped apart by the issues that would lead to our Civil War, you remember our Civil War, right? Mrs. Hale proposed that the last Thursday in November would be a great day for a national Thanksgiving. She had a few reasons for it. Mostly she just wanted to see us all as a nation giving thanks. And she published editorials, and she wrote reams of letters to politicians, and she even wrangled some of the transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, to write poems and stories in support of this cause of a national Thanksgiving. And in my digging around, I couldn't determine if she was a Unitarian, but she sure acted like one. She spent 17 years selling this idea. And in 1863, it caught on. President Lincoln declared a national day of Thanksgiving in the hopes of creating a national event that would help kind of unify this really messy, divided country. I want you to notice that at this point, it's entirely a civic holiday with kind of nostalgic religious roots. Okay? All right. Once it was declared, retailers loved it because, getting ready now, one more thing to spend money on. And publications elaborated on this myth of the first Thanksgiving, complete with fictional menus. As a culinary anthropologist, I find this always very interesting, that the basic elements of this ritual meal were fairly affordable. So that meant even poor Americans could participate in recreating their fictional heritage. Okay, and schools were taught or teaching the myth so that the waves of immigrant children could now learn to identify with pilgrims. And we even made our little palms into turkeys. We became American. And then Norman Rockwell went ahead and just sealed the deal with that image of freedom from want, the turkey, grandma. Okay, that's some of the backstory on the Thanksgiving narrative. Now what? Because now we're in a postmodern funk with the ability to see both the exploitation and the good intentions that shaped this holiday. And now we're having trouble. How are we supposed to be happy celebrating a bold-faced colonial lie, a land grab that amounted to genocide of Native peoples? Oh, like I said, no amount of gravy. Because we now know that any time that we suppress a truth, it will rise up to haunt us mid-forkful. So what if we were to reshape the narrative, make it more inclusive, more intentional? What are the bits that are still worth hanging on to? Okay. We might start out by acknowledging that Thanksgiving is this really blurry blending of civic holiday with religious roots, because it's not Easter and it's not the 4th of July. It's something in the middle. It's giving thanks for the generosity and the opportunity of this land, this beautiful, fertile, idealistic experiment that is America. The civic core of this narrative is all about becoming American. And we're all invited to identify with the Pilgrims. Hence, stuffing my child into a little bonnet. But what if Thanksgiving became the holiday when people who were already American were to welcome recent immigrants with a meal? What if we were encouraged to identify with the Native Americans, not in cultural appropriation, but in recognition of their generosity? What if it was not just a gathering of friends and family, but one of settled peoples and newcomers? What if your measure of a successful Thanksgiving was the number of new immigrants at your table? Political and religious refugees would be extra points. Oh, yeah. What if the meal was also not just a fictional, traditional meal based upon New England ingredients? Like, okay, who's seen a cranberry growing around here? What if it was local ingredients like prickly pears or wild plum relish or whatever is growing where you are busy being American? What if it was a meal that welcomed then in also the tamales and the ravioli and the samosas of all of the previous waves of immigrants who are integrated now? Wouldn't that be a way more interesting meal? A meal worth celebrating? Wouldn't that give us all roles that we could live into more honestly? Okay. If we wanted to reclaim the religious core of that old story, we would give thanks for the harvest and for the discovery process that happens when we sit down with people who are different from us and share a meal. That holy exchange. What if Thanksgiving were to be the day when we look at our shared losses and blessings and then look into the eyes of one another and be as generous as God in sharing our food and peace? What if we could do that? What a country this would be. What a people we would be. What a meal that would be. Might it be so someday, and for us all.